Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 70th deck and it's titled, I Get Knocked Down But I Get Up Again. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So as always, before we get into the actual deck tech, I do want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts and some ways that you can help support this channel. If you are interested, you can follow us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, over on Reddit, u/POYNZ13. You can send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of those are great ways to reach out to us to kind of let us know what's going on. I'll do my best to try to keep you updated as to what new videos are coming on, and sometimes I just kind of post random thoughts as well. So if that's something you're interested in, please do check us out. And of course, if you're interested in supporting us a little bit more directly, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link. Any cards that you purchase after clicking on that link, we get a little bit of a kickback from as a thank you for sending TCG Player some customers. It's a great way to help support us and, of course, to support TCG Player as well. And if you're looking to support us even more directly, you can head on over to our Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and we have several different tiers available at the $3, $5, and $7 level, where you're able to help support us every month and get a little bit of something is a thank you for doing that as well. So there's things from getting access to the deck lists an entire week early, getting access to a Discord channel where we help build the decks, and you could even participate in playing in some of the games for the channel as well. And at the very top, you would get access to the full unedited gameplay videos, so you would be able to hear the players' commentary as they interact with each other rather than just my own. And then there's also the random card of the month. So rather than just the random cards of the week, I will send you one of the 4 random cards of the week every month. You can choose whether that is something that you want to pick, or if you just want me to randomly select a card. All of that is perfectly fine. So if that is something that you might be interested in, please do check it out. Like I said, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. And of course, got to give a huge shout out to our 4 current patrons. We have William Swiftfoot, we have Doodle, we have Observer Will, and we have Calvin Schmidt. So to the 4 of you, thank you very much for all of your support. And with all of the introductions out of the way, let's get into our deck tech. So our first thing we got to do is, of course, talk about our random card of the week. This is an actual random card, not suggested this time. I just went to scryfall.com, hit the random button, and it popped up with Sun Titan. So Sun Titan is 4 white for a 6/6 giant. It's got vigilance, and whenever Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So Sun Titan is a staple in most mono white decks. So of course, we got to build around it in a very unique way, and I figured what better way to do that than to pair it with a very powerful and still unique commander, adding an additional color to it, making it Orzhov. So this week, we are playing Lurrus of the Dream Den in the command zone, which is 1 and a hybrid Orzhov for a 3/2 cat nightmare. It has companion, but obviously, since it's our commander, it can't be our companion. It also has lifelink, and once during each of your turns, you may cast a permanent spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. So Sun Titan lets us get things that are value 3 or less. Lurrus lets us get value 2 or less. So with the 2 of them combined, our goal is to be able to get most permanents in our deck back with either of their abilities. So with our commander and random card out of the way, let's take a quick look at some themes for this deck and kind of take a look at how this deck wants to run. So first up, we of course have sacrificing. We want to make sure that we can bring our permanents back from the graveyard, but we can't do that unless our permanents are in the graveyard. So we need things like Cartel Aristocrat, which is a white and a black for a 2/2 human advisor, allows us to sacrifice another creature, and Cartel Aristocrat gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Like I said, we need to be able to sacrifice our creatures to be able to get them back. So Cartel Aristocrat is a great way to do that. Plus, it itself is 2 mana, so if we have to sacrifice another creature to Cartel Aristocrat and then sacrifice Cartel Aristocrat to something else, we can get Cartel Aristocrat back with either Sun Titan or Lurrus because it's 2 mana. So Cartel Aristocrat really fits what we want to do. It's a great sacrifice outlet, and it's a great reanimation target for our creatures. Which leads us into our next theme. We want to reanimate some creatures. Now, it's great to have Lurrus in the command zone, and it's great to have the power of Sun Titan in the deck, but we of course have to make sure that there are other ways to reanimate our creatures. So, for example, we have Priest of Fell Rites, which is a white and a black for a 2/2 human warlock. You can tap it, pay 3 life, sacrifice Priest of Fell Rites, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. And it does have Unearth for 3, a white and a black, but honestly, we're not really going to want to unearth it because that would exile it at the beginning of the next end step, or if it would leave the battlefield. We would love to keep bringing it back with Sun Titan or with Lurrus. Again, 2 mana value fits either of those qualifications. And Priest of Fell Rites is a phenomenal card for this deck because not only does it reanimate something it could get back, say, Cartel Aristocrat, but it actually sacrifices itself, meaning we can just play it again and keep bringing things back and back and back. And yeah, it does have a tap ability, so it's not something we can loop infinitely because we would need to untap with it, but it's still incredibly powerful, and it gives us the opportunity to sacrifice it, get something back, cast this again, and then next turn repeat that process. So while it's not an infinite value loop, it is still a value loop on its own, which can be incredibly powerful. So we're sacrificing things, we're returning things from our graveyard to our battlefield, and last but not least, we have a Cleric subtheme, which I know sounds a little bit strange. Why would we really want to care about Clerics? Surprisingly, there are a lot of Clerics that do the things that we are trying to do. There's a ton of Clerics that cost 1, 2, or 3 mana. There's a lot of Clerics in white and in black. And there's a lot of Clerics that actually care about lifelink or life gain, which is something that is incredibly important for this deck because there's a lot of Cartel Aristocrat style effects like sacrificing something which allows us to gain a life, lose a life, whatever it may be. So if we can capitalize on the ways that we can gain the life, this deck gets a lot better very, very quickly. So an example of all of this in one little package is Cleric of Life's Bond, which is a white and a black for a 2/2 vampire cleric. Whenever another cleric enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So already we're able to sacrifice our clerics, bring them back into play, gain some life with Clerics of Life's Bond. And whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Cleric of Life's Bond. So this cleric can get super big super quickly, while still always being a reanimation target. Because it's 2 mana, Sun Titan can get it, Lurrus can get it, Priest of Fell Rites could get it. There's always going to be ways to bring this out of the graveyard. And every time we're bringing back a different cleric or we're sacrificing a cleric, there's always going to be life gain triggers to trigger the Cleric of Life's Bond. So this is incredibly powerful when combined with the ton of clerics we have in the deck, which, by the way, I didn't initially go out of my way to make this a Cleric tribal deck. There were just a lot of Clerics that fit our theme, so I figured we might as well put some Cleric payoffs in there, and I think the end result is pretty powerful. So those are our themes for the deck, and of course with those out of the way, let's take a look at some key cards, the cards that really help this deck run, really help this deck win some games. So first up, we have Marauding Blight Priest, which is 2 and a black for a 3/2 vampire cleric, notably a cleric. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So I just mentioned that there are a ton of little tiny life gain triggers in this deck. A creature dies, we gain a life. A creature enters the battlefield, we gain a life. If we can turn that into a way to win the game, that makes it incredibly powerful. So now that takes our Cleric of Life's Bond and says whenever another cleric enters the battlefield, we gain a life and each opponent loses 1 life, which is a much, much stronger ability. And it's something that really helps us win the game if, for some reason, we can't get through with combat damage. So Marauding Blight Priest is an absolute MVP in this deck, and I would highly recommend that if you're able to get it, somehow into play as quickly as possible. Always make sure you can protect it. Make sure that it's not going to get exiled. You'll want to reanimate it. It's really going to be helpful for the strategy for this deck. And then, next up, we have Aura Skyclave Hierophant, another Cleric. Shocking, I know. It is 2 white-black for a 3/3 core Cleric, has lifelink. Whenever Aura Skyclave Hierophant or another Cleric you control dies, return target Cleric card with lesser converted mana cost from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, if we were to sacrifice Aura and Marauding Blight Priest is in our graveyard, Aura would trigger, bringing back a 3, 2, or 1 mana value creature. We don't have any zeros. And we can choose Marauding Blight Priest, bringing it back into play. But that also can continue to work if Aura is in play. We could sacrifice a 3-drop to get a 2-drop, sacrifice that 2-drop to get a 1-drop, sacrifice that 2-drop, and then use something like Sun Titan to reanimate the 3-drop and do it all again. So this can get incredibly powerful, especially when, again, we combine it with our enter the battlefield and leaves the battlefield triggers, gaining life and losing life for our opponents. So Aura is a huge value engine, and if you haven't seen some of the videos on this channel where Jason or Shawn have played their Aura decks, they are absolute monsters when it comes to life gain and reanimation, so I think Aura definitely deserves a slot as a key card in this deck. And then, finally, our last key card is by invitation only. Normally, I wouldn't put board wipes on a key cards list, but there's a bit of an exception for this one, because by invitation only is 3 white for a sorcery that says choose a number between 0 and 13. Each player sacrifices that many creatures. This is super, super relevant because we have a ton of ways to get our stuff back, so we don't really care if it dies. We honestly sometimes like our stuff to die because we have the leave the battlefield triggers or the death triggers, and we can kill as many as 13 creatures for every single player. And that's not just destroy, that is sacrifice. So if we have something that benefits us for sacrificing, by invitation only is a super, super useful card in that point. But it gets around things like Indestructible. It gets around things like Hexproof and Shroud. And we can choose the number between 0 and 13. So if we happen to have, I don't know, say 5 creatures and each other opponent only has 2, we can choose 2, get rid of everyone else's creatures, and still keep our own. So by invitation only is super relevant in this deck. And if we're able to cast it when we have something like Aura in play, Aura would trigger on every single Cleric that dies, meaning we would still get a ton of value by returning all of these Clerics to the battlefield. So, like I said, normally I wouldn't talk about a board wipe in the key card section, but I think by invitation only does enough with this deck to warrant its place, so I thought it deserved a spot. And with all of that being said, let's move on from our key cards and start talking a little bit about some cool interactions in this deck, some things that work very well together. Our first cool interaction is going to be between Leonin, Relic Warder, and Animate Dead. Normally, in these kinds of decks, I don't include a lot of infinite combos, especially besides the fact that most of the time infinite combos are super expensive, mostly for the fact that they're not super fun, and a lot of times they don't even win the game, they just kind of go infinite and do something kind of crazy. But in this deck, there are a couple of infinite combos that do actually win the game. And we're going to talk about a couple of them that I did include that are super cheap. So this first one here, Leonin, Relic Warder, and Animate Dead, means that we can get an infinite number of enter the battlefield effects and leave the battlefield effects. So if we combine that with something like a Cleric of Life's Bond, we can gain a bunch of life. I mean, we can gain infinite life. And if we combine it with something like a Zulaport Cutthroat, we can drain our opponents for an infinite amount of life. So this is not a super crazy combo, but it is something to keep an eye out for. And I suppose with all of that out of the way, I should probably read the cards so we know what they do. So first up, Leonin Relic Warder is white for a 2/2 cat cleric. When Leonin Relic Warder enters the battlefield, you may exile target artifact or enchantment. When Leonin Relic Warder leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. And then we have Animate Dead, which is 1 and a black for an enchantment, and this is going to be kind of wordy, so bear with me. Enchantment Aura. Enchant creature card in the graveyard. When Animate Dead enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it loses Enchant Creature card in a graveyard and gains Enchant Creature put onto the battlefield with Animate Dead. Return Enchanted Creature card to the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. When Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, that creature's controller sacrifices it. Enchanted Creature gets -1/-0. So, in essence, the way that this is going to work, we are going to hopefully have Leonin Relic Warder in the graveyard. We're going to cast Animate Dead, targeting the Leonin Relic Warder to bring the Relic Warder back into play with Animate Dead attached to it. When Leonin Relic Warder enters the battlefield, we're going to choose to exile Animate Dead. By exiling Animate Dead, it's now gone, and Animate Dead forces us to sacrifice Leonin Relic Warder. So we sacrifice Leonin Relic Warder, which triggers the Leonin Relic Warder, returning Animate Dead to play, which then reanimates Leonin Relic Warder. So we are able to infinitely enter the battlefield with the Relic Warder and infinitely sacrifice the Relic Warder with the Animate Dead, meaning that as long as we have some way to either gain life or drain our opponents, this just wins us the game on the spot. And yeah, I know this might not be the most fun way to end a game, but all games have got to end, so it's a great backup if you don't want to start beating into people with all of your creatures, or if you don't want to slowly drain them out with other sacrifice effects. It's at least something to be aware of. And in a similar vein, moving on to our second cool interaction, normally I don't include the random card of the week in the cool interactions. I like to talk about as many cards as possible. However, when the random card of the week can go infinite with another card in the deck, I feel that's worth mentioning. So Sun Titan can go infinite with Angelic Renewal, again giving us an infinite number of enter the battlefield or leaves the battlefield triggers. So once again, Sun Titan, 4 white for a 6/6 giant with vigilance. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And if we pair that up with Angelic Renewal, which is 1 and a white for an enchantment, whenever a creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may sacrifice Angelic Renewal. If you do, return that card to the battlefield. Now, notably, we do need a third combo piece to go with this, but as long as we have anything that can sacrifice a creature, this goes infinite. Because we could sacrifice Sun Titan with Angelic Renewal on the board, Angelic Renewal sees a creature die, so we can sacrifice Angelic Renewal to return Sun Titan to play. When Sun Titan returns to play, he returns Angelic Renewal to play, and we can repeat the process. So it doesn't immediately go infinite like the last cool interaction does, but as long as we have a sacrifice outlet, it does go infinite with only one more card. And again, it doesn't win the game on its own, so that is something to be aware of. I wouldn't just do this because you can. People might get kind of annoyed. So make sure you have some way to win the game or some kind of value to get out of it, like gaining infinite life, because otherwise you're just kind of doing nothing for no reason, and that's not fun for anybody. So definitely a way to win the game if that's something you need to do, if any other strategies don't quite get you there. But those are our cool interactions for the week. I hope that they were at least a little bit entertaining. I think we don't do infinite combos too often, so it's a little bit different. But that brings us to the last part of our deck tech this week, which is, of course, the price. And the price of this deck is pretty cheap. It's actually only about $63.78, so almost half of what we're looking for, about 60% or so of our total budget limit. And a good portion of that actually comes from Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants. So it's always a good feeling when you look at the deck list and the most expensive card is only about $4. But if you do need to cut $4 out of a deck, bring it down closer to about $59, Ajani would be a good one. Because as good as he is, he's not perfect. So let's read through what he does and then we'll kind of talk about it. Ajani, Adversary of Tyrants, is 2 white for a 4 loyalty legendary planeswalker Ajani. +1, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. -2, return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And -7, you get an emblem with, at the beginning of your end step, create 3 1/1 cat creature tokens with lifelink. Now, right off the bat, it is important to note that the ultimate would be very useful. However, it's not game winning for us, so we don't really care too much about trying to ultimate Ajani. What we really care about is the fact that he can come in and use his -2 twice in a row before he dies. We can return 2 creatures with converted mana cost 2 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, which is exactly what Lurrus does. It's exactly what Sun Titan does, although only 2 instead of 3 in the case of Sun Titan. But it's for free. So Johnny is super relevant and super useful, and if we want to keep him around, put +1/+1 counters on, say, things with lifelink or just some massive creatures, that is another great thing to do. However, like I said, it is the most expensive card in the deck, $4, so if you're looking to trim just a little bit of price, a Johnny would be a good card to cut. On the other hand, though, if you're looking to maybe increase the price of the deck, I do have some suggestions for some out-of-budget upgrades and what I would replace them with. Now, a quick disclaimer before we get into this, these out-of-budget upgrades probably could already fit into the deck with the current price and the fact that we're almost $40 below budget, but sometimes I think it's more relevant to leave very expensive cards out just for budget's sake. So, the first one, we have Ranger Captain of Eos, which is going to be 1 white for a 3/3 human soldier. When Ranger Captain of Eos enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library, and you can sacrifice Ranger Captain of Eos, and your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So, the reason I would suggest putting this into the deck is because, 1, it's 3 mana, so Sun Titan can get it out of the graveyard if that's something we want to do. It's a 3/3 for 3, which is just already pretty decent, especially if we can put +1/+1 counters on it. When it comes in, we can search our library for a creature that costs 1 or less, and we have a ton of creatures that cost 1 or less, things like Soul Warden that are able to kind of combo with some of our other things. And it's able to sacrifice itself to stop our opponents from casting non-creature spells this turn. So if for any reason our opponents are going to storm off, we can make sure to sacrifice it, stop them from doing their thing, or we can actually sacrifice this at the start of our turn to make sure that our opponents can't cast anything that's not a creature on our turn to stop us from doing what we want to do. And then, once we've sacrificed it, we can just get it back with Sun Titan. So Ranger Captain of Eos really ticks all of the boxes for what this deck wants to be doing and is an absolutely amazing card for this deck. However, it is $19, which is a very steep price for this card. However, if you do want to include it in the deck or you just have one laying around, then the card I would recommend taking out for it is Shepherd of the Cosmos, which is 4 white for a 3/3 Angel Warrior. It's got flying, and when Shepherd of the Cosmos enters the battlefield, return target permanent card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, foretell for 3 and a white. So, Shepherd, again, does kind of what we want to do, right? It's returning things from the graveyard. It's a 3/3 flyer. It's evasive. Unfortunately, it's 6 mana. Whether it's 6 mana in 1 turn or 6 mana spread across 2 turns with Foretell, Shepherd of the Cosmos is really expensive because it kind of falls short when you realize we can't get it back with Lurrus, we can't get it back with Sun Titan. Most of our reanimation effects can't actually return this to the battlefield. So yeah, it reanimates one thing, but then it's kind of gone for good and we don't get much more use out of it. So I think that the one-shot reanimation effects are okay. However, if you get the chance to have something like Ranger Captain of Eos, which can tutor up multiple creatures, protect you on multiple turns, I just think that's a little bit better. So this would be my recommendation for what to take out of the deck and what to put into it if given the chance. But that is the only out-of-budget upgrade for this week. I had looked at others, but none of the other ones really caught my eye, and I think this is really the only one that I would truly recommend. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at how this deck actually performs in a game. Because again, we can talk about this deck as much as we want, but if we don't see how it performs in a game, there's no way to know how it really works. So the game that we're going to be playing this week is up against 3 very difficult decks and 3 very good opponents. We have Sithis, Harvest's Hand, being played by Bilal, Edgar Markov being played by Shawn, and Nekusar the Mind Razor being played by Jason. So Sithis is a deck that we've seen multiple times on this channel, typically played by Jason, but in this case by Bilal. This is an Enchantress deck who wants to play a ton of enchantments, draw a ton of cards, gain a bunch of life, and really just outvalue its opponents with everything it's trying to do. So I am a little bit worried about the Sithis deck because I have lost to Sithis quite a few times in the past. I know just how difficult it can be to take care of when it gets rolling. So I'm hoping that we can kind of get under it, maybe do a little bit of damage early, kind of keep up with the creatures and all of that, make sure that we always have blockers available. And I think we'll be okay with Sithis, but it does concern me. Edgar Markov is again a deck that we've seen on the channel before, but very, very powerful commander. Shawn's build of it is very much like vampire tribal all the way. He wants to play as many vampires as he can, drain people out of their life, attack them with a ton of vampire tokens. And this is another one. I'm not super concerned about the vampires. I think we'll be able to handle the go wide strategy. My concern is if he somehow gets Edgar to be super big and unblockable or gives him trample or anything like that, because we just have a ton of little 1/1s and I don't think we're going to be stopping too much commander damage coming in from Edgar. So that's my main concern with the vampires. And then finally, Jason's Nekusar deck, I think, is my vote for the biggest concern I have of all the decks at the table, mainly because Sithis kind of relies on combat damage once they get super big creatures. Edgar definitely relies on combat damage. Nekusar doesn't. Nekusar can just let us draw cards and just drain us out of the game. And since we want to be getting creatures in and out of our graveyard, the problem is if he's drawing us a bunch of cards, we're discarding cards, we're getting our stuff back, we might, unfortunately, see it as a good thing that he's drawing us a ton of cards, but I've played against Nekusar in the past, and I know it always seems like a good thing, but it never winds up being a good thing for the rest of the table. So I do think Nekusar is going to be my main concern, just forcing us to draw cards, forcing us to wheel, forcing us to, have additional draw steps or additional cards drawn in our upkeep, whatever it may be. So that's my vote for the most concerning deck at the table, but I will admit they are all very strong decks, so I am a little concerned about all of them, but I am very interested to see how this game goes. I'm very interested to see how we can perform. So I hope you all enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you also enjoy the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Shawn, myself, and then Jason. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a Bountiful Promenade. Shawn plays a Wooded Foothills, sacrificing it to search his library for a Sacred Foundry, putting it into play tapped. I play a Temple of Silence, scrying 1. Jason plays an Izzet Guildgate. Bilal plays a Forest and casts his commander Sithis Harvest's Hand, which allows him to draw a card and gain life whenever he casts an enchantment. Shawn plays a Sulphur Springs and then casts Talisman of Conviction. I play a Swamp and cast Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose 1 life while I gain 1 life whenever a creature I control dies. Jason plays a Halimar Depths, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order. Bilal plays a Hall of Heliod's Generosity, and then casts Sanctum Weaver, which can tap for mana equal to the number of enchantments he controls, drawing a card and gaining a life with Sithis. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts Boros Signet. I play a Plains, and attack Jason for 1, and then in my second main phase, I cast a Marauding Blight Priest, making each opponent lose a life whenever I gain a life. Jason plays a Command Tower. Bilal plays a Fortified Village, revealing a Plain so that it comes into play untapped, and then cast Renata Called to the Hunt, letting each other creature he controls enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, and this also triggers Sithis, drawing him a card and gaining him a life. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Anawan the Ruin Sage, forcing each player to sacrifice a non-vampire creature in their upkeep, and this also triggers his commander, making him a 1/1 vampire token. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Bilal for 3, and then in my second main phase, I cast my commander Lurrus of the Dream Den, letting me cast a permanent mana value 2 or less from my graveyard once each turn. Jason plays a Storm-Carved Coast, and then casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size. Bilal plays a Plains, and casts Argothian Enchantress, coming in with a +1/+1 counter, and letting Bilal draw a card whenever he casts an enchantment. Then he casts Destiny Spinner, which enters with a +1/+1 counter, draws Bilal 2 cards, and gains him a life, making his creatures and enchantments unable to be countered, and allowing him to activate it and turn all his lands into creatures with power and toughness equal to the number of enchantments he controls. After that, he casts Aura of Silence, drawing 2 cards, gaining a life, and making all his opponent's artifacts and enchantments cost 2 more, and also casts a Swords to Plowshares, exiling Anawan but gaining Shawn 4 life. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Merciless Eviction, exiling all enchantments. In response, Bilal sacrifices Aura of Silence, destroying Shawn's Talisman of Conviction, then the board wipe resolves, clearing away most of Bilal's board. I play a Plains, and then attack Bilal for 3, and Jason for 3 with Lurrus, gaining 3 life when he deals damage. This triggers the Blight Priest and makes each of my opponents lose a life. Then in my second main phase, I cast Aura Skyclave Hierophant, which triggers whenever a cleric I control dies, letting me return a cleric of lesser mana value from my graveyard to play. Then at the end of turn, Jason casts Vision Skeins, letting each player draw 2 cards. On Jason's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts his commander Nekusar the Mindrazor, letting each player draw an additional card each turn, but doing 1 damage to his opponents whenever they draw a card. At the start of Bilal's turn, he draws 2 cards and takes 2 damage, then plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, casts a Setessan Champion, drawing a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever he casts an enchantment. He also casts Hyena Umbra on the Setessan Champion, giving it +1/+1 in first strike, while also drawing 2 cards, taking 2 damage, and putting a counter on the champion. When Shawn draws his 2 cards for turn, he takes 2 damage, then he plays an Arid Mesa, sacrificing it to search his library for a Godless Shrine, paying 2 life to put it into play untapped. This allows him to cast his commander Edgar Markov, and moves to combat, attacking me with Edgar, triggering his commander and putting a +1/+1 counter on each vampire he controls. I block the damage with Zulaport Cutthroat, killing it, gaining me a life, and making each opponent lose 2. At the start of my turn, I draw 2 cards and take 2 damage, and then recast Zulaport Cutthroat from my graveyard thanks to Lurrus, and I follow that up by casting Cruel Celebrant, making each opponent lose a life while I gain a life whenever one of my creatures dies. I then move to combat, attacking Shawn for 3 with Aura, gaining 3 life when it deals damage, and making each opponent lose a life. At the start of Jason's turn, he draws 2 cards but doesn't take any damage. Then in his first main phase, he plays a Swamp and casts Howling Mine, letting each player draw an extra card in their upkeep. After that, he casts a Molten Psyche, forcing each player to shuffle their hands and their libraries and draw that many cards. In response, Bilal casts a Heroic Intervention, and Shawn casts a Swords to Plowshares targeting Nekusar, exiling it, gaining Jason 2 life, and preventing us all from taking any damage for drawing cards. Bilal draws an extra card in his upkeep, plays a Plains, and then casts True Conviction, drawing 2 cards, putting a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion, and giving all his creatures lifelink and double strike. He moves to combat, attacking me with the champion, and I block with Zulaport Cutthroat, gaining Bilal 4 life while I gain 2, and each of my opponents lose 3 when the Cutthroat dies. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an additional card, and then plays a Command Tower, and casts a Vampire Nighthawk, making a vampire token. After that, he casts Malakir Bloodwitch, making another vampire token, and making each opponent lose 6 life while he gains 18 life since he controls 6 vampires. He moves to combat, attacking me for 9 with Edgar and a token, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his vampires. In my upkeep, I draw an extra card, and then I play a Swamp and cast a Soul Warden, gaining me a life whenever another creature enters the battlefield. After that, I cast Jaren Corrupted Bishop, creating me a 1/1 human token and losing me a life whenever he enters the battlefield, or another non-token human I control dies. Since this makes me a human token, it also triggers Soul Warden twice, gaining me 2 life and making each of my opponents lose 2 life. In Jason's upkeep, he draws an extra card, and then plays an island, and casts a Talisman of Creativity, before casting a Storm Fist Crusader, letting each player draw a card and lose a life in Jason's upkeep. This also gains me a life and makes each of my opponents lose a life. After that, he casts a Wizard class and immediately levels it up, drawing 2 cards. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws an additional card with the Howling Mind, and then casts Jukai Naturalist, making all his enchantments cost 1 less, drawing him 2 cards, putting a counter on Setessan Champion, gaining me a life, and making each of my opponents lose a life. He then casts an Eidolon of Blossoms, drawing a card whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield, drawing him 3 cards, putting a counter on the champion, gaining me a life, and making each of my opponents lose a life. After that, he plays a Wooded Bastion, and casts Hallowed Haunting, allowing him to make a spirit token with power and toughness equal to the number of enchantments he controls whenever he casts an enchantment. This also allows him to draw 3 cards and put a counter on the champion. In Shawn's upkeep, he draws an extra card, plays a Path of Ancestry, and then casts a Cruel Celebrant, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life whenever one of his creatures dies. This also gains me a life and makes each of my opponents lose a life, and Shawn also makes another vampire token, again gaining me a life and making each of my opponents lose a life. After that, he casts Gifted Aetherborn, making another vampire token, gaining me 2 more life and making each of my opponents lose 2 more life. He moves to combat, attacking me with 6 of his vampires, triggering Edgar, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his vampires. I block Edgar with Jaren, taking a total of 20 damage, while Shawn gains 4 with lifelink and Jaren dies, making each of my opponents lose 2 life, while I gain a life, and then Aura triggers, returning Elderfang Disciple from my graveyard to play, gaining me a life, then making each opponent lose a life, as well as discard a card. In my upkeep, I draw an additional card, and then in my first main phase, I cast Cartel Aristocrat, which can sacrifice a creature to give itself protection from any color. This also gains me a life and makes each opponent lose a life. After that, I cast Zulaport Cutthroat from my graveyard, gaining another life and making each opponent lose a life. In Jason's upkeep, he draws an additional card and Stormfist triggers, letting each other player also draw a card and lose a life. He then plays an island and casts Izzet Signet before casting Underworld Dreams, which makes each opponent lose a life for each card they draw. After that, he casts a Reforge the Soul, making each player discard their hand and draw 7 cards, which also results in all of Jason's opponents taking 7 damage. He then casts a Soul Ring and passes. In Bilal's upkeep, he draws an additional card and loses 2 total life. After that, he plays a Sarah's Sanctum and moves to combat, attacking Jason for 24 damage with his entire board. Jason blocks what he can, but still dies, so Bilal gains a total of 17 life, knocking Jason out of the game. In Bilal's second main phase, he casts Archon of Sun's Grace, letting him make a 2/2 Pegasus token whenever an enchantment enters under his control. This also gains me a life and makes each of my opponents lose a life. And then he casts Sterling Grove, giving all his enchantments Shroud. This also draws him 3 cards, puts a +1/+1 counter on Setessan Champion, makes him a Pegasus token and a Spirit token, gains me 2 life, and makes each of my opponents lose 2 life. Shawn casts a Legion Lieutenant, giving all his vampires +1/+1 and making a vampire token, gaining me 2 life and making each of my opponents lose 2 life. He then moves to combat, attacking me with his entire board, triggering Edgar, putting counters on all his vampires. I block all of his creatures on the ground with everything I have except for my human token. Before damage though, Bilal casts a Path to Exile, attempting to exile Marauding Blight Priest. In response to that, Shawn casts Mortify to attempt to destroy the Cartel Aristocrat. With both removal spells on the stack, I sacrifice Aura to Cartel Aristocrat, giving her protection from white. This makes each opponent lose 3 life while I gain 2, and also triggers Aura, returning Jaren from my graveyard to the battlefield. When Jaren enters, he makes a human token, losing me a life, gaining me 2 more life, and making each opponent lose 2 more life. After that, I sacrifice a human token, gaining me 2 life, and making each opponent lose 3 life. I'm able to repeat this process with the other human token and Elderfang Disciple, gaining 4 life and making each opponent lose a total of 6 life, knocking Bilal out of the game. After that, I sacrifice the Soul Warden, making another human token with Jaren, losing a life, gaining 2 life, and making Shawn lose 3 life. The token also gets sacrificed alongside Lurrus to do the final amount of damage to Shawn, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. There were so many triggers going on in that game. I'll be honest, it was a pain in the butt to try to edit, but it was super, super cool that we were actually able to win the game in Shawn's combat phase. That's not something that happens very often. I think our deck really just kind of started strong and never really quit. We got almost exactly what we needed the whole time. We had a ton of sacrifice outlets. We had Aura to kind of reanimate some of our stuff. We never found the Sun Titan, unfortunately, but I don't think we quite needed it. The rest of the reanimation did pretty well for itself. The other decks at the table, Jason also looked very scary early on, and I think that if Nekusar hadn't been killed when he was, Jason would have been a much bigger threat. And I do have to give a big thank you to Jason, because him wheeling everybody at the table with that Underworld Dreams, I'm pretty sure is the only reason I was able to kill Shawn, so I do very much appreciate the assist there. Bilal's Enchantress deck did what Enchantress wanted to do. He was drawing 2 to 3 cards every time he cast an enchantment. He had a massive life-linking double striker that's getting +1/+1 counters and drawing cards, and I think that if he'd been able to find a way to give it unblockable or trample, it really would have meant the end of us a lot sooner, so I'm very happy he didn't find that. And then, of course, Shawn's Edgar deck just made a ton of vampires and made them all super big. The fact that he was able to swing with Edgar 3 or 4 times and just keep putting +1/+1 counters on his things was absolutely crazy. I mean, he hit me for, I think, 20 damage at one point. So, absolutely insane power levels across all the decks at the table. And I'm very happy that out of all the super strong decks, we were able to come out on top. I think that's pretty sweet. But let me know what you think. Let me know if there are any improvements that could be made to the deck, if there's anything that you think could be added. And otherwise, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.